Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be talking about income inequality, and my guest is an expert on this topic. Mr. Chuck Collins is an author and a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., where he directs the program on inequality and the common good. He's an expert on economic inequality, and his recent book of 2018 is titled, "Is Inequality in America Irreversible?" Mr. Chuck Collins, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill, for having me.
I appreciate you being with me today. The title is fascinating. It's a great book. It's small. You can read it very quickly, but it's loaded with a lot of good information. But what is your main thrust? Does the title say it all, or is a little more behind it than just income inequality, I guess?
Well, actually, I've been thinking about this and writing about it for a couple decades, and one of the books I wrote was called Born on Third Base, which is about the experience of advantage, how advantage works. And I wrote another book called 99 to 1, how wealth inequality is wrecking the world and what we can do about it. But so I have been thinking about this for a while, and I would just say, coming out of the pandemic, and I know we're not out of it yet, but in a way, the inequalities in the United States made us less prepared, made our society more brittle and less able to respond. And I'm afraid that the pandemic will be kind of an accelerant on these trends of income and wealth inequality.
Now, years ago, when in fact, people from all around the world so often say when there's income inequality, we just pointed our fingers at the Southern Hemisphere, Latin America, and some African countries. But today that is changing, and income inequality is really worsening, especially in the United States and in several of the Organization for Economic and Cooperation and for Development countries, the OECD. Is it not?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways it's a global trend. There are societies that have done a better job of offsetting or reducing the impact of inequality, but there's a global trend, which is wealth flowing to the top, not just the top 1%, but the top 1/10 of 1%. We just did an analysis that there's now 2,365 billionaires in the world, and almost a third of them are in the United States. But that is a dramatic increase in 10 years. And their share of the wealth pie, in fact, during the pandemic, those global billionaires saw their wealth go from 8 trillion total to 12 trillion, mean a $4 trillion increase just to those 2,360 plus individuals. So that, that is a global trend that's disrupting local economies and societies all over the world.
What are some of the statistics? I'm sure you probably have a drawer full of statistics on this of how, like you said, 1/10 of 1% of the wealthy receive it. How much, say, is the top 1% control of the wealth in the United States as opposed to maybe another country or 2 or 3 countries elsewhere?
Yeah, the share of wealth controlled by the 1% has gone up. It was probably in the high 20%, and now it's somewhere between 36 and 40% of the wealth. So that richest 1%, their share of the wealth pie has just continued to grow. That's very, that's a troubling trend. And the corollary to that is the share of wealth owned by the bottom half of U.S. households has continued to shrink.
That is frightening. That is frightening. What are the main causes for this? Is it due to federal legislation from Parliament or the U.S. Congress, or is it the decline of labor unions, or the fact that collective bargaining is under siege, or there's more deregulation? But what or maybe all of the above and more? I'm not sure. But what are the main factors contributing to this?
Yeah, I think you kind of named a bunch of them. There's sort of a patchwork of forces, but in some ways it has to do with power. So if you think about in the years after World War II, the power of trade unions, a third of workers in the United States were in a union. And that meant that there was sort of a voice for workers at the table in terms of public policy. And now with the percentage of workers in a union, a private union, less private company, less than 10% of the workforce. So that meant that power shifted from workers to corporations more and more. And the wealthy, I think of wealth holders got more power over the economy as well. So I think what we're seeing is the rules that govern the economy. And you mentioned taxes, global trade, where government invests money or doesn't invest money. Does the minimum wage go up or is it stay stagnant? All those things are the rules that govern the economy. And they have been tipped in favor of the wealth holders at the expense of wage earners. So I would say there's been a power shift, and that power shift has led to an economy that's really good if you're wealthy and not so great if you work for a living.
Chuck, those are issues that all tie into this, but we've been seeing more articles and studies about corporations, and this is not a shock. It's been going on for decades now. Large corporations that are very, very wealthy and they're turning great profits that don't pay taxes. What's contributing to that? Is it because of members of Congress writing legislation favorable to that corporation, or is it because of fossil fuel subsidies, let's say, or a high-powered lobbyist to lobby members of Congress? There's deregulation. What is causing that? Because it's totally unfair, as it strikes me, and they're not paying their fair share.
Yeah. I think there are ways in which a global company can play more shell games with their earnings and their profits, and that's what's happening. They hire people who used to work at the IRS to run their tax offices, and it's partly because government has also looked the other way. We continue to give corporate tax breaks overall, and then I think the system is porous, meaning it's a little more, there's not the enforcement and oversight that maybe there was in years past. So you're right, it's a long-term problem, but it's gotten worse since the 2017 Trump tax cut. And it's clearly something we have to fix if we're going to make investments in infrastructure and the like.
And you're talking about these tax breaks. So often too, we see that there are incentives to basically offshore, and not only incentives to hide money in tax havens like the Cayman Islands or wherever, but also to offshore jobs and to go to other countries to avoid taxes. How big of a problem is that?
Well, it's a big problem because now our tax code actually encourages companies to move jobs and offshore profits. It's like Apple and Google and all these companies, manufacturing companies, all have tax incentives to reduce their taxes in the U.S. by increasing their production offshore. So that's actually part of this infrastructure bill. It's fascinating. President Biden has proposed a $2 trillion investment in infrastructure, which is very badly needed. And he wants to pay for it by closing down these incentives that give companies an incentive to move jobs overseas. So I think it's an all-American job creation infrastructure bill that will kind of close down some of those distortions that corporation and the ways corporations are gaming the tax system.
Mhm. And of course, I'm not an expert on this, but I think prior to the Trump tax bill that left a huge deficit, over $2 trillion deficit that we have in this country, that I think the corporate tax was like 35%. It was dropped to 21 or something, 23, and now it's going to go back up to 26 or 27. That doesn't seem inherently unfair to the corporations, especially ones who are making huge profits.
Yeah, the whole debate about corporate taxation has been kind of frustrating because it's true that the statutory corporate tax rate was 35%, but almost no companies paid that. And even prior to the Trump tax cut, the actual corporate tax rate was closer to 20%. So the Trump tax cut knocked the corporate tax rate down further, and the effective rate, the rate that they actually pay, is now closer to 10%. And there's now all these companies that are paying no corporate taxes. So, I think under the president's proposal is to restore that tax code to a higher rate. But the real key is closing these loopholes that these companies use. And that's something where we need to have global cooperation, I think, to do that right.
Exactly. And we're going to be talking about that in just a few minutes. That's very important because it has to be a global effort to some degree. I was just curious though, with the tax breaks that these companies get, is it seems to me that they're just disproportionately unequal. And so often you hear companies and very wealthy individuals say, well, you give money to wealthy people and we have this trickle down economy. But the trickle down economy never has really worked the way they've described it, even with these huge tax rebates, if you will, or tax cuts for the wealthy. They usually go out and buy up stock or they do something else. They don't create jobs, that's for sure, in most cases. Now, maybe in a few they do, but in most of them, it's still they pocket the money and walk away, do they not?
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of been undertaking a 40-year experiment. If you think of the economy as a laboratory, ever since Ronald Reagan came in and espoused this sort of trickle down economics, we have been steadily cutting corporate taxes. We've been reducing taxes on the very wealthy. Taxes on wealthy individuals under, I kind of jokingly say, under the socialist presidency of Dwight Eisenhower, were were very much higher. There were higher rates on higher income earners. And we've been on a 70-year process of reducing those taxes. So it isn't working. And the impact is it increases inequality, it increases the debts, it increases the cuts in budget to things that matter to people. And it increases, as you say, it encourages corporations to do stock buybacks or make non-productive investments because they just are reaping windfalls.
Mhm. And one can think back when you read about the Eisenhower administration, or perhaps people who were there. Of course, he far from being a socialist or a communist or whatever. And of course, when he was really the architect of the interstate highway system. And just imagine trying to undertake that massive job and huge expense with all these companies and individuals taking their money offshore, not paying their fair share of the taxes. There's no way, if we were in the same straits back in the 50s that we are today, we would be in deep trouble, would we not?
Yeah, and here's the thing: these are public infrastructure investments that will boost the whole economy. These are things that will strengthen businesses. It's just that these are freeloaders. The Main Street businesses will be paying, the rest of us will be paying. We need to have working transit systems, a working electrical grid system, water purification systems, and we have to make investments to prepare to live in a reduced fossil fuel economy. We need to retrofit our old leaky buildings and prepare for, adapt to climate change. Everybody knows, and even these big companies know we have to make those investments. They're just trying to get everyone else to pay for them. And our position is everybody should pay their fair share.
It's only fair that we do that. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our show and you would like to share it, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at income inequality, an issue that affects a vast number of people, of the 8 billion people on the planet. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Mr. Chuck Collins is an author and a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., where he directs the program on inequality and the common good. He's an expert on economic inequality, and his recent book is titled Inequality in America, Is It Irreversible? Chuck, this is a very timely topic. Before I go any further, though, please mention your website. You have an inequality website we want to make sure to get out to people.
Yeah, if your listeners want to learn more, they should visit inequality.org. And that's a website that is kind of a portal. We have data, charts, and information. And we have a weekly newsletter that comes from me. People can sign up for that. And we try to have a sense of humor and sense of possibility and talk about what are the things we can do together to reverse these extreme inequalities.
And this is something we all need to focus upon. It's absolutely critical. You hit the nail on the head. You've hit several nails on the head during the course of the program, but one in particular was how it has to be an international initiative. And when I think of that, I think really there are regional organizations that are out there, the Organization of American States and European Union, OECD, whatever. But really the only international forum is at the United Nations. All 193 countries of the world come together in the UN General Assembly. Now, the United Nations is not a one world body or a governing body. It doesn't have sovereignty over all the 193 countries or any of that. Some people believe it does, but it really doesn't. But the UN can be a convener, and that's one of its strengths. It brings the countries of the world together to talk about these issues like climate change, human trafficking, human rights, whatever it may be. But it seems to me that even though the UN can't pass bills to require companies to pay taxes or whatever, they can still be a voice of reason and serve to bring all these countries together to work on these problems. Can it not?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that the United Nations has brought us together to try to face some of the big challenges in terms of environmental issues. And this is the economic divide that is we have both inequality within societies, within countries, and globally. And I can't think of a more important forum and a place to convene those discussions. It's ultimately going to be other bodies and nation states and some of these trade organizations that are going to hammer out the new rules and trade agreements to have a fair economy. But right now, countries are being pitted against each other in the race to the bottom. Who will have lower labor wages? Who will have lower environmental standards? Who will have more secret hiding places for global wealth? That's the wrong race to the bottom. We want to be able to come together and lift standards.
And the UN is doing that to some degree. In fact, a large number of the specialized agencies, the UN, while we were talking, I was just thinking the UN International Labor Organization has been very strong on talking about income inequality, the role of automation, artificial intelligence. And folks can go to the website at www.ilo.org. But there are many other groups within the UN. The Global Compact is focused on this and focused on transparency, empowering workers, defending human rights, and just on across the board. So the UN has done a lot on it, but again, an international summit to really elevate the status and the visibility of this type of topic, I think would be extremely, extremely important. And I'm sure that would be helpful as far as moving it forward. And she mentioned if it hadn't been for the United Nations conferences on climate change, we would not even be close to where we are today to dealing with this climate crisis. It's no longer just climate change, the weather's changing and that type of thing. It is now a crisis. Well, Chuck, what are there any other suggestions you have as to how we can improve this situation and to overcome it? Any other comments on what we can do to reduce this income inequality and level the playing field to some degree?
Yeah. Well, one thing is to learn from countries that just have less inequality. I think of the Nordic countries and even Canada to the north. They have much less inequality. Now, why is that? It's because they have a higher social safety net floor. There's a sort of decency floor through which people cannot fall. There's universal health insurance. There's access to adequate income. So, the United States can do more to raise the minimum wage, ensure that people have access to health insurance, just create that decency floor. The other thing these less unequal societies do is they invest in public investments that create opportunity for the non-wealthy, access to higher education, access to skills, access to social mobility, access to capital to start businesses. Again, the Nordic countries all do that. And so there's more social mobility. We like to think in the United States, we're the socially mobile society where you can be born in poverty, but you can rise. That's an old picture, unfortunately. A lot of Canada has higher levels of social mobility now than the United States. And the third thing, and probably the most controversial but important, is we need to put a brake on the concentration of wealth and power at the top. Campaign finance laws that thwart the influence of money, as well as tax policies that tax wealth and invest it in public investments. And that's why these, other countries have less inequality, is they tax extreme wealth and invest it in things that create opportunity for everyone else. And even the wealthy in those countries benefit because they're living in less unequal societies with more dynamic growth and mobility. So we do have something to learn. And we did that in the United States from the 50s to the 70s. We kind of undertook those kinds of investments. So part of it's just learning from what we've done in the past and what others are doing now.
And we can certainly learn from other people and apply what they're doing here. And again, no one's, well, saying that people cannot become wealthy or anything like that. We're just saying you have to pay your fair share. And that's only fair because so many people in our society do pay their fair share, but a large number do not. And it seems like the situation is getting worse and worse with each day. Now, again, if our viewers would like, they can go to your website at www.inequality.org. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now,
that's,
yes, please.
well, no, I was going to say, I think, it doesn't have to be this way. And I think, as you implied, Bill, we can come together and fix the rules of the economy so we grow together, not grow apart. And I would argue it's not in the interests of the wealthy to see us pull apart and become an apartheid society. So I think it's an opportunity for all of us to come together and fix these inequalities.
That I'm glad you mentioned that too, because it seems we are moving towards an economic apartheid society if we continue on the road that we're on right now. And do you see that actually happening? I mean, the haves have more and the have-nots have less.
Yeah, I think if we just stay on the same, and let's just take the United States, if we continue to pull apart in the way we have for the last 40 years, we're going to become more and more like a Brazil, where you have a tiny oligarchic wealthy class who send their children to school with bodyguards, and you're going to have a shrinking precarious middle class, and you're going to have a large number of people who are desperate and have no financial reserves and feel precarious and insecure and mad. And that's not where we don't want to keep going down that road.
Yes, I know when I lived in Latin America for several years, that was the one thing that always struck me, the way that you had houses that were guarded. They had barbed wire around them. They had glass sticking up, broken glass sticking up, guards in front of them. And again, the income inequality was supposedly much worse in South America or Latin America than it is in this country, but we're certainly passing them, or we're on track to do that. But this is so important. And Chuck, in our last 30 seconds, can you tell us all, outside of going to your website, which we were going to do, is there anything else that we can do to learn more about this and to get involved in helping to rectify this horrible situation?
Yeah, I just think continuing to educate ourselves. I'm thankful that you're having this forum because I think it brings attention to this. So many of the challenges in our society are rooted in these inequalities, as well as the solutions. We can reduce these inequalities and just be much better societies to live in for everyone.
We can do it. We have to do it. We have no choice. But anyway, Chuck Collins, author of Is Inequality in America Irreversible? It's a tremendous topic. It's a timely topic. It's, as we say in the media, it's evergreen. It was popular 2 years ago. It'll be popular 20 years from now, but hopefully we'll be doing better and moving in the right direction. But Chuck, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thanks for having the conversation, Bill.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.